I think we'll get going. Adam, are you ready to go?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to this community-based decision-making through land use planning workshop as part of Links to Learning. I hope you guys are enjoying the conference so far. I certainly had a great time yesterday. I learned a lot. Um, Great. I really enjoy the app that we're using for this conference. It's nice to be able to network with everybody. So yeah, welcome to this presentation. Just for those folks who may not know who we are, myself and Adam will introduce ourselves shortly, but we work for the First Nation Lands Management Resource Center. And we provide support to First Nations who are signatories to the Framework Agreement on First Nation Lands Management. And if you're not aware of the Framework Agreement, basically it's a what's referred to as a sectoral self-government initiative. And the Resource Center, we provide support to nations that are developing their land code. And we also provide support to nations who have a land code in place and are operating, under self-government. So it's a big year for us. We're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Framework Agreement. And in fact, just last night, we found out that the 100th community in Canada adopted their land code. So really big milestone for us. I believe the community is Mashtuesh. I can't pronounce it exactly, but they're in the eastern part of Canada. But huge congratulations to that community. I'm Stephen McGlenn. For those of you who don't know me, I've been at the Resource Center since 2019 in the capacity of planning and curriculum delivery. You may have seen me on other Resource Center webinars and workshops back before COVID. Prior to joining the Resource Center, I was a lands manager at Sumas First Nation in the Lower Mainland for about 4 years. So really got my hands dirty in terms of what it's like to operate with a land code. And to practice, community-based decision-making and land use planning and the topic that we're going to be discussing today. And I'll turn it over to Adam to introduce himself.
Thanks, Stephen. And hello, everyone. And I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to present here today. I haven't had a chance to dig into any of the conference details yet, but I'm really excited. Stephen told me all about it, so I'm pumped to kind of follow along today. I am calling in from Treaty 7 lands here in Calgary. And I'm a registered professional planner. I started with the Resource Center in September 2020. And so before that time, I was working as a consultant and also worked a little bit in academia and as well in government back in Ontario. I worked a lot of environmental assessments and other land use planning mechanisms. So with that, maybe we can just provide an overview of what we're going to be talking about today on the next slide.
Yeah, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We do have someone that's monitoring the chat. And we are going to have time at the end for question and discussion. But if anybody's having any technical issues or that, please just put it in the chat, and folks will be moderating, and they'll let Adam and I know if there are any issues.
Yeah, that's a good reminder, Stephen. Yeah, and especially if I'm speaking too fast or too slow or not loud enough or whatever it is, just feel free to send me a chat and we can adjust accordingly. So just an outline of what we're going to be talking about today. We've kind of broken it down into 4 parts. So the first one is planning and decision-making, a self-government perspective. The second one is Indigenous community planning and just looking at building trust in community planning processes. The third part is going to be different examples of community-based decision-making processes in land use planning. And then the fourth part is going to be tools and techniques to help build trust in the planning process. So I know that the 4 parts may seem like a lot, but we've actually really tried to build in some time at the end there for nice discussion. We really view this as an opportunity for mutual learning, and so we can hopefully help you guys learn about things you've never learned before, and vice versa when we come to the discussion portion. It would really be great to have that engagement.
Okay, so yeah, for part 1, we're going to be talking about decision-making and land use planning. And as you guys know, at the Resource Center, we're supporting First Nations in self-government. So really, this is about self-government. And as you'll see in our presentation, planning is such a core part of self-government. So we'll look at some examples. In terms of, operating with the land code, it really is, it's an opportunity to kind of redefine what community engagement looks like and what community-based decision-making looks like in your community. Developing land code processes is really about empowering the membership, trying to build consensus, and really it is about that trust and confidence in the capacity of the First Nation as a governing body. And as we'll talk about more in this presentation, moving away from the Indian Act, it's all about rebuilding that trust. And that goes, not just between the organization and the community, but trust in between departments, between staff and leadership. All that trust is necessary at all levels to really foster this kind of community-based decision-making. And again, as we'll talk about further in the presentation, planning is all about governments making decisions that are in the best interests of the community, and community-driven processes really help to foster that kind of confidence between the membership that the actions that a First Nation are doing are in their best interests. So we'll talk about that a lot more. We just want to set a bit of a foundation in terms of our terminology here.
Yeah, and just building on that, we really want to provide just some clarity on how we're viewing engagement and consultation. I know that these terms often kind of get used interchangeably at times, but there's a line that we've drawn just so we can have our heads better wrapped around it, and then hopefully you as well. So the first definition is just consultation. So if you can press the so yeah, consultation, what we're looking at is more of an externally driven process. So it's when industry or government is consulting on a specific land planning or land development activity that may affect your First Nation. So more of that duty to consult realm. And so ideally it would involve a proponent seeking to obtain free, prior, and informed consent, also called FPIC. And so when we look at engagement, it's more of an internally driven process, looking at community building. That's when a community engages their members for the purposes of planning, self-government, any community development or other development activities. So it also may involve that FPIC components to it. And that would be a decision that your community would make. But also there's a piece of it of just understanding that often you have to engage your community to see how they want to be engaged. And that's something we'll build on a little bit more too throughout the presentation.
Thanks for that, Adam. So yeah, Adam and I are both planners, and there's such importance in terms of how we define terminology and what language we're using. And planning is a term that gets thrown around all the time. And what is meant by that term, because it really is central to this idea of community-based decision making. So planning is a core function of self-government in that, but it's something that everybody does. Everybody makes plans, whether we want to make something happen, we want to prepare for the future, we want to prevent something from happening. We all live very busy lives, so we plan, to really manage our time and efforts, to, envision what we want to do in the future, and whatnot. And First Nations as governments, as self-governing nations, they also have to plan for those reasons that I listed, but also for additional reasons. When you're self-governing, you usually have a specific type of authority, whether it's, a land code and associated agreements and legislation that guides that. So you really have to be familiar with your authorities, and planning can help you do that. In terms of how you implement your self-governing authority, it's so important to strategize, to build that competency and confidence in your self-governing authorities. As we all know, self-governing nations, you take on a lot of risk and liability when you become self-governing. So planning is really essential to identify what those risks and liabilities are, and to identify those mitigation strategies. As First Nations, governments are providing critical services and programs to membership. So planning is necessary just to maintain, the kind of service delivery, especially in the midst of major disruptions like COVID or other emergencies like flooding. So it's important to plan ahead for that. Of course, we're all, in this limited staff time, limited budget, limited resources. So planning is so important just to, allocate and coordinate based on those limitations. And with that, there's also multiple priorities, and there's always You know, being operational under land code, in my experience, you're always kind of reacting to what's happening, and it's very difficult to plan ahead. And so that planning piece becomes really critical, just to kind of maintain where you're at, and hopefully you have time to look ahead a little bit. Planning under a land code, really, it's planning is about balancing multiple interests. And if your community does have, you know, certificates of possession in your land, you've got to balance kind of the communal interests of the nation versus the individual interests of those CP holders, right? And planning is a vehicle to identify what those interests are and to balance them in decision making. Of course, planning is about, you know, blue sky, envisioning, you know, the ideal future for your community. And it's really about engaging, involving, and empowering, you know, your members and the citizens of your nation, so that, you know, at the end of the day, you're making decisions that promote the health, well-being, and overall interests of your community. So again, we really want to emphasize that planning is a core function of a self-governing First Nation, and that is something that the Indian Act stole and took away from communities. And we all know that Indigenous communities have been planning for thousands of years, right? But through the imposition of the Indian Act, that was taken away. So planning, core function of self-government, and community engagement is a core function of planning, because planning is all about identifying the public interest and trying to make decisions that are going to benefit your community. So community engagement really is a core piece to that. And so self-government and good governance under a land code is really about trying to foster that community-based decision-making at all levels. And by all levels, there's a little kind of spectrum on the right side of this slide. By those sort of decision-making levels, you know, starting at the very top, those are the high-level governance type decisions. And then below that, there's kind of community planning, lawmaking, and getting down to the operational and site level. And we've got more examples to kind of clarify what we mean by these different levels of decision-making, but really just emphasizing that community-based decision-making needs to occur at all levels. And in a lot of ways, a community's land code will provide guidance, or at least identify thresholds when community engagement is required. But the land code doesn't say a lot about in terms of how you do that, and that's kind of what we'll talk about today. But again, community engagement is a core function of planning, and planning is a core function of government. So in terms of governance and community governance, there's just a few concepts here that we wanted to talk about. Governance and governments and operate under a land code, it requires capacity. You know, a lot of the effort in terms of becoming operational under land code is to make decisions a lot more quickly than what happens, you know, through Canada under the Indian Act. Good governance under land code is really about competency. You have to understand your land code authority and what that means for decision makers. And again, we're going to talk a bit more about that later on. You know, you need that consistency in terms of you're always following your policies. You know, you're not making special exceptions for certain people or certain bodies that are seeking, you know, authorization or something under your laws. You're trying to build consensus, cooperation. Again, these are things that the Indian Act took away from communities, right? So it's self-government under land code. We're trying to reintroduce this stuff and build that those kind of capacities. You're talking about confidence. You know, community-based decision-making can really help build confidence between your community and your leadership and your organization. But it requires a lot of these things, you know, consistent communication, trying to build consensus, managing conflict, and building a sense of community. Again, it's trying to fill those gaps that the Indian Act left in our communities. Over to you.
Yes, we just want to look at a couple of different types of community-driven plans and laws that are used in self-government. So the first is a comprehensive community plan, which I'm sure many here are familiar with. Then there's land use plans and environmental management plans, housing plans and community design guidelines. There's also economic development strategies, as all community-driven planning processes. And then there's also subsequent laws that can be developed through self-government and land code. So that could be an environmental assessment law or environmental protection laws, subdivision development and servicing laws, zoning laws. And as mentioned before, for those exceptional or emergency situations, that you can have COVID-related laws. And then you can also have other just laws that, allotment law and community quality law. And I think, I was looking at these nice images on the right-hand side. I was going to put some laws and some reports down as images, but I'm like, that's kind of boring. And I think like disconnects from the point of why we are planning, and is to protect these areas and to understand that these laws and these plans really help build communities and protect the environment, which I think is something that's important to a lot of folks. And so just unpacking a little bit more of what land use planning is under land code. Really, as you can see in the diagram on the left-hand side there, land code is really the foundation or the beginning point for a lot of land use planning, and really sets a legal foundation to move forward with. But you'll see the next point there, and it's a very important one, is community guidance. So community guidance feeds into land code, and also it permeates throughout the whole planning process. And so really, when we talk about community-based decision-making, all planning processes really should be driven by the community and be community-led as much as possible. But understanding that, there's other things that are involved with planning. So looking kind of onto the right-hand side here with the bullet points, just looking about the ethics. So planning is about ethics. It's about accountability and transparency within your community. And we're talking about building trust, and those help build trust. It's understanding what the role of government is. So it's implementing those land use controls, identifying community visions and objectives, really promoting communities' public interest, and practicing good decision making. So it's almost creating a foundation for what good decision making can be. I think planning in its core really is about decision making and helping create informed decision makers. And just looking more at community engagement, about empowering community members and building capacity. It's a really big piece there. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the relationship of consultants, planning consultants, working to support First Nations communities, just as they look to develop their land use plans, and how to balance that role so capacity is being built as a part of that relationship. And then also just the integration of planning as well. So looking at all these different components that build a community, that are part of a community. So it's housing, infrastructure, environment, land use, and also sustainability efforts. Not to mention just health and well-being of a community. They're all parts of planning. So sorry, go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, so just another piece on that integration one is with respect to financial planning, and just because I know the AFOA is involved in this, and it's really difficult, I think, from a self-governing perspective, because nations have all these different authorities. We've got land code over here, that's the framework agreement, and then we've got our financial authorities under the Fiscal Management Act, right? And so how do we create this integrated planning process where we're bringing these authorities under kind of one planning umbrella, right? So that we're working together and not apart and in separation from one another. And again, that's kind of this legacy that the Indian Act has left with so many communities, is this fractured and divided planning landscape, if you will. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of how do we move away from the Indian Act, and this concept of Indigenous community planning and land use planning kind of being an example of that. So trust is one of kind of the the fundamental themes of our presentation this morning, and the importance of trust and self-government. It can't be overstated. Trust is so fundamental for how governments work in any jurisdiction, whether it's First Nation or non-First Nation, or what citizens need to have trust in their government, right? And planning is a way to do that, especially if you're following through and being consistent with your plans, right? So again, we've had this 150 years of oppressive colonial control under the Indian Act, really a lot of examples of poor planning and mismanagement, under the Indian Act. And that causes divisions and tensions and feelings of mistrust and anger in the community, right? And it's very challenging to get around that. Conflict and tension is natural, it's just a natural part of community life, right? However, the Indian Act really failed to set up First Nation governments with the capacity and with the processes to effectively manage that kind of conflict, right? And so just this quote here from Val Napoleon that I feel is really powerful, to be lawful, for self-governing nations to be lawful means to not be oppressive, and means that we have to not do things the way they were done under the Indian Act. So we're going to provide some examples of, how to approach that. Just a bit of a timeline here, just kind of, I put this slide using the idea of a forest to kind of metaphorically represent self-government. So on the left, this is before the Indian Act, where First Nations and Indigenous communities were self-governing since time immemorial. They govern themselves using, complex systems, and, the idea of, or the interconnections of land and identity and governance, it was all interconnected, right? And then, in the mid 1800s, with the imposition of the Indian Act, it was literally an attempted destruction of Indigenous systems of governance, and in favor of this, colonial control. And as Arthur Manuel famously put it, Indian reserves were created almost like holding pens, right? To relocate communities into those holding pens, right? So we've got this really brutal legacy that we're trying to move past. And as I've said before, the Indian Act, from a planning perspective, the Indian Act does not foster planning. There's no planning processes. There's a lack of transparency and accountability in the Indian Act. There's a lack of community engagement. The community plays no role in the Indian Act. And there's just no way to enforce good planning and good lawmaking under the Indian Act. So as a result, we've got, as I've said, these fractured, divided, under capacity, underfunded communities, right? So moving forward, starting in 1996 with the development of the Framework Agreement, we've got this kind of recognition of authority, from Canada. And it's important to state that the Framework Agreement it's not a program of the government. It's not a delegation of authority from Canada to First Nations. The Framework Agreement is self-government. It's a recognition of your self-governing authority. And the Framework Agreement provides, one mechanism to get that recognition. There's other ways, through treaty and whatnot, but the Framework Agreement is, as we seen yesterday with the 100th community operating under a land code, it's a very successful and it's a good initiative, I guess, in terms of self-government. So we want to talk a little bit about what the actual difference is, in terms of, if we're talking about community engagement and building trust, what's the difference between operating under the Indian Act and versus operating under a land code? So to start, as we've said, the Indian Act was imposed by Canada. There was no choice, no input, no consent, anything like that. Versus, the Framework Agreement and land code and getting your communities out of the Indian Act, that's a community-driven process. The community has to approve. It's negotiated on a government-to-government level. Under the Indian Act, members don't have a role in decision-making, but under a land code, they can. You can set up those thresholds under your land code for when community input has to happen, when community approvals have to happen, that sort of thing. I've said this already, but the Indian Act, it lacks any planning structure, and it's built on this idea of, the supremacy of European ideals and patriarchal ideals, and that, whereas under land code, communities have the opportunity to do their own planning and to, enact plans and laws based on their own Indigenous philosophies and principles. Under the Indian Act, Chief and Council has a very sort of vague and undefined authority, and that leads to, a lot of decisions being made without community input often. And so with a land code, by comparison, oftentimes, the land code kind of restricts the decision-making authority of Chief and Council. And we're going to talk more about this in a couple of slides, but really there's due process requirements in your land code. And whether it comes to introducing and passing laws or issuing interest in the land, like 99-year leases, all that has to happen in accordance with the rules and procedures of your land code. The same goes with developing land. There's a lot of interest in economic development, and that's obviously one of the themes of the Links to Learning conference. Development needs to comply with your land code rules and authorities. Usually First Nation land codes speak about the need to have a land use plan, and even put community approval thresholds in the land code before a land use plan can be enacted. And then more importantly, development has to comply with your land use plan. So there's now a mechanism to have an official plan declared through your laws, right? Under the Indian Act, you can have a plan, but it just kind of sits there and floats ambiguously and doesn't have any real meaning and effect. But with a land code, your plans can be enacted through laws. Land codes often contain conflicts of interest provisions, so to prevent, people on council from issuing interests to themselves or their friends or their families. And really getting back to this idea of community-based decision-making, the accountability changes in your land code. You're no longer accountable to the minister or to Indian Affairs. You're accountable to your own membership, and that's how it should be for any government. So the framework agreement is a mechanism for communities to move away from the Indian Act. The image on the screen here is Samath First Nation, otherwise known as Sumas, and this is the community where I was a lands manager for about 4 years. And I just wanted to put this image on the screen to show an example of how the Indian Act fractured this community, just in physical terms, right? So you're looking at the screen, you can see the large green, the bright green line that goes across the center of the community. That's a BC Hydro easement. We've got the provincial highway that actually cuts the reserve in half. And we've got multiple roads. And if you see kind of in the middle of the screen, there's this area that's actually cut out of the reserve, right? And so this is one of the legacies of the Indian Act in terms of its physical effects. So it was so easy for governments and government agencies to take land from Indian reserves, and the resulting fractions and divisions and the planning difficulties that arise from that make planning really challenging in a community. And that is one of the benefits of operating under a land code in the framework agreement, is that the framework agreement really provides powerful protections for lands. So municipalities and provinces can't go and expropriate lands for highways or transmission tower right-of-ways or railroads or whatever the case may be. You've got those really strong protections of lands in the framework agreement. So that's an important difference, I guess, and one of the benefits. And so Sumas or Samath became operational in 2011. I joined as the lands manager in 2015. And as we'll talk about, being operational under a land code is a journey. Just because you have a land code in place doesn't mean the work is done. In fact, quite the opposite. That's where self-government really starts, once you have your land code in place. And it takes communities years to get into the swing of things, and it's not easy. But I just wanted to showcase this as an example of a community that's really, they've come a long way, and they're moving away from the Indian Act. So they're moving away from the Indian Act, and land code, it helps us to build a more structured approach to community-based decision-making and planning approaches. And by a structured approach, I'll try and demonstrate visually what I mean. So to start with, we start with this recognition of self-governing authority, which is your land code. And that sets out some of the basic rules and procedures as I showed in that previous table, in terms of, what decisions can be made, when certain community approvals are needed. Through your self-governing authority, now you can start doing some community planning. And oftentimes for land code First Nations, that's a land use plan. The land use plan provides a lot of different, policies and directions for a community, but overall it's providing that vision and that direction for the community. And that really requires, staff and leadership to be involved and to be champions of your plans. From your community plans and from your land use plans, you can identify, what are our needs, in terms of our lawmaking authority, and what laws do we need to achieve, the vision that we've set out in our plans. And, with land code, there's very few requirements for what laws you need. And a lot of people ask us, like, what laws are we supposed to develop? It really depends on your community context and, what your planning vision is. And you can, for the most part, you can develop any laws that you need. You're not obligated to develop certain laws. It's based on your context. And there's, we have a lot of examples of what laws will be helpful for you. And we can help, assist in that law development piece. But really, it's about how do you fulfill the vision in your plan? What laws do you need? And those laws are going to give you the real practical things you need to make decisions, forms, fee schedules, regulations, defining authorities and roles. So again, under the Indian Act, Chief and Council had a really vague and ambiguous decision-making role, but under land code and the more laws you develop, those decision-making authorities get more tightly defined, if that makes sense. From your laws and your policies, now you can start, kind of thinking about operationally, how are we going to implement this stuff? So there's work planning, there's that strategic and integrated planning, so working across departments, even things like job descriptions and organizational structures, you need to look at that operational side to make sure that it's lining up with your self-governing planning framework and not working against it, right? But with your operations, then you're getting the human resources, the professional expertise, and you're starting to actually implement your work on the ground. And when it comes to community-based decision-making, again, it's happening at all of these levels. So the land code is community-driven, your planning is community-driven, your laws are community-driven, and even your operations. It's about being transparent and accountable at all levels of government. And again, we'll have some more concrete examples, but typical questions that you're going to ask your community. What is our long-term community vision? What laws and policies do we need? Your community may not be able to say we need this specific law, but they can tell you what issues they're dealing with, and that can help you craft the certain laws that are going to help address those issues. How do we protect the environment and promote economic development? What areas need to be protected? Where's a good place to develop? Again, that issue of balancing communal rights versus individual rights or CP rights, that becomes a huge challenge, right? And there's just such a need to bring the community into those discussions rather than making them behind closed doors. In terms of land development, should a given development proceed? That's an opportunity to bring that to community. What is the right decision to make? There's so many decisions that a First Nation has to make on a daily basis, right? And whether or not you're making the right or wrong decision, that's an ethical problem, right? So planning is about ethics, and I believe strongly that the more we can involve our community and do community-based decision making, the more, I guess, confidence we'll feel that our decisions are the right decisions. So again, this is all about building trust and trying to repair that legacy from the Indian Act. Over to you, Adam.
I was muted. Sorry about that. Rookie move. So I just want to talk a little bit further about the role of consultants in community-based planning. I know in this section we're talking about building trust and moving away from the Indian Act, and I think it's also important to recognize that working with consultants, consultants may not be well-versed in land code, or they're maybe not even well-versed in Indigenous planning and what historically how your community has planned. So I think it's really important to think about what role consultants will play, because often lands managers, we get it, like they're very busy, wear multiple hats, and so often don't have the time to do that work. And so it's really nice to have consultants be able to support those processes. But at the end of the day, it is about finding a balance there and making sure that the consultant is working on behalf of the community. So just some of the ideas that we've had, just a first bullet point there is, consultants can really help design and facilitate those meaningful conversations with your community members. But that really does have to be based on the foundation of understanding your community and how they do like to be engaged. The next point there is seeking to build capacity within land staff. So if you have a registered professional planner coming in and doing this work, they should ideally be working with someone in the land staff to help build their capacity and to help just provide some education on what this certain components mean, because there's always opportunities for learning. And even with like simple things like project management techniques, right? So just ways that like file management or ways to make sure that people are following deadlines and all those sorts of things that aren't the funnest part of planning, but they're very critical pieces of the planning process. And just to provide support where it's needed. So First Nations should be leading the planning and engagement processes, ideally. And really the consultant should just be in that role to provide expertise or experience that the community doesn't have, or to do the work that you just don't have time for, but that they should really take direction from the lands manager, staff, the community, right? It should be a community-led process. And then the last point there is they should be accountable for the planning and implementation outcomes. So often you can see consultants will come in to support the development of a land use plan, but then once that contract is over or the land use plan is finalized, there's maybe just like stepping away from that process and saying, well, here's your document, here's your land use plan, and go forth and work with that. But I think there's an accountability piece there, especially if you are hiring a registered professional planner. There's a piece where if the land use plan isn't exactly what your community wanted, or it's really difficult to implement, or there's certain factors that weren't considered, I think it's really important to make sure that planner is accountable for their work, and there's two pieces to that. I think that one piece is fixing that to make sure that it does actually reflect what the community wants, or makes it so it can be implemented, but also the fees associated with that work. It shouldn't be new fees. It should be under the existing contract that was had. I kind of compare it to if you take your car into a mechanic and you ask them to fix the brakes, and you come back and your windshield wipers don't work, then they should also be responsible for fixing your windshield wipers. So even though it may seem unrelated, that there's some accountability piece there. And then just on the right-hand side, we just have a couple best practices for note. So again, RPP is a registered professional planner. MCIP is a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners. All RPPs who operate in Canada should be an MCIP as well. And then also just issuing a request for proposals. And I think we have some more additional details later on about why it's important, but it just really helps make sure that there's a even starting point for consideration for what consultant will come in. Often we may rely on existing relationships, or the fact that a consultant has done work before for the community. But not to say that was bad work, but maybe there's a better consultant, or maybe there's a consultant who has better expertise in a certain area that you're looking to plan in. So it really helps just kind of create a good even starting point for consideration. I see part 3. Maybe just before getting into part 3, I know are we going to wait to answer questions, Stephen, or did you want to? I saw one come up in the chat there. I'm not sure if you wanted to wait or.
Yeah, I'm okay if you want to answer that, Adam. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So just from Vesna, does it make sense for a community to simultaneously work on both their land code and land use plan? That's a really great question. So I'll start off, but Stephen, I definitely can add on to that. I know. So. When you think about it theoretically, there are opportunities for efficiencies. I guess if you look at developing your land code and land use plan at the same time, you can laws, similar topics about land governance and engagement opportunities that you can align those. But it does make it a little bit challenging at times, because the land code is really the foundation. It's the legal foundation to move forward on, and it identifies how a land use plan would be ratified by the community, what those certain specifics look like, and then just also what powers certain land staff has or chief and council has. There's a lot that's identified in the land code as far as creating that foundation for understanding what next steps can be taken. So it can be challenging when you do the land use plan at the same time, because you're not entirely certain what you can do under land code, because the land code hasn't been finalized. Hopefully that makes sense, and I'll kick it over to Stephen for any additions.
Yeah, no, I think it's great, Adam, and great question, Vesna. There is a tendency, I think, for Canada to suggest that a land use plan is a good step to do before you embark on land code, or to do it simultaneously. And my recommendation is to wait until your land code is done before doing your land use plan, because as Adam said, planning manifests itself depending on your legal jurisdiction, right? It manifests differently under the Indian Act than it does under a land code. And it also can be really confusing for staff and for community members to understand the difference between land code and a land use plan. And from a planning perspective, they're kind of, they're sort of an expression of self-government. But land code, as Adam said, it's really about that legal foundation. And a land code isn't really a forward-looking document. Like a land use plan is all about envisioning the future and how do we get there? What are the policies and objectives and goals that we need to accomplish to get to our vision? Whereas the land code is like, what is our law-making authority? How are we going to make laws? As Adam said, what are the authorities of staff and chief and council, that sort of thing. So there really is a big difference, but what often happens is a community will do a land use plan, and then they'll adopt a land code. And then because their land code sets out rules and procedures for land development, they have to revisit their land use plan and amend it and make it, sort of comply with the land code. So it's really about understanding, again, this kind of structured approach to decision making. And the next slide hopefully will help. But yeah, I do recommend doing your land code first and then hopping into land use plan. And if you're in a situation where you are doing both at the same time, that's fine. It's not the end of the world. And like Adam said, there's probably efficiencies, that you can do, because they're both really important land-based planning processes. But it's really key just to enforce the difference between the two and to understand how land code informs land use plans, and where you go from there. So maybe I'll dive into the next slide because it's really timely, and hopefully can help answer your question, Vesna. So we wanted to provide some real life examples of what are some common decisions that you have to make when you're operating under a land code. So before we get to what those decisions are, again, just want to reinforce this kind of structure. So land code being your foundational land law. So that's setting out the rules and procedures for how you make laws, when you need to engage the community, and sometimes when you need to get community approval and consent, right? So that's your legal foundation, is your land code. From there, you develop a land use plan that allows you to exercise your land code authorities in a way that you can reach your community vision. From your land use plan, you're going to identify certain laws, policies, procedures, forms, and regulations that again are going to help you achieve the vision you've identified in your plan and to address maybe some of the issues that your planning process identified. A lot of communities that are operating under a land code, they use advisory committees or sometimes lands authorities to help in the decision-making process. Of course, you've got your staff and your operations, and finally, you've got your elected leadership. So before we get into, what kind of decisions are made under this structure, I just want to point out that, again, the land code is very broad. And as you move up this structure, things are sort of moving towards the left. They're becoming more defined, right? So towards the left side of the screen, that's where you have more definition in terms of the roles and authorities, right? So the land code, the land use plan, your laws and authorities, those are defining how decisions are made and what types of authorities people have in the decision-making process. So again, compared to the Indian Act, where leadership has, a very broad, undefined sort of role in decision-making, under a land code, it's the opposite. The more laws and plans you develop, typically the more definition you're bringing in and the more you're trying to define people's roles and authorities. So in terms of decision-making, just a quick note, land code communities do have the option for delegated authorities. So not just leadership, but also staff and even committees or lands authorities can be delegated authorities under your laws and plans. So it's not just leadership with the final decision-making authority in those cases. So to get to some real life examples, starting at the very high level in terms of governance and community development, some decisions that the Land Code First Nation might have to make is deciding, whether or not to approve a law under your Land Code authority. You might be faced with a lot of economic development. So, all right, we need to develop a development law under our Land Code. You might be trying to develop a lands advisory committee. So you need to determine, how do our members get selected to sit on that committee and what's their role? Maybe staff have proposed or identified the need to do a land use plan, and council and senior staff need to allocate funding so that you can do that planning. That's a really important decision. And then broadly, once you have your plans, how do you achieve the vision? How do you implement those plans? That's going to be a key decision. You're going to have to allocate resources. You're going to have to, choose between competing priorities and to try and make things happen, right? Next, this kind of a broad theme of decision-making is land, environment, and resource management, which is, such a vast, there's so many different types of decisions that happen in this field. But some common ones in terms of, what areas do we need to protect for environmental reasons, for cultural heritage purposes, etc. An environmental assessment law could be a really key law for a community in terms of, again, it could be related to development and how do we make sure that environmental impacts are identified in the development process and mitigated. How to ensure compliance with your laws, plans, and policies. That compliance piece that requires a lot of resources in terms of monitoring, following up, and sometimes enforcement. The next kind of broad theme, a very critical issue in land code is granting interests. And so, someone may be requesting to lease your lands. Well, should we approve this lease request? What are the processes that we need to be able to assess, is this lease complying with our plans and our laws? Again, what is that process? A lot of communities, they go into land code and they're still kind of in that Indian Act mentality where it's Canada that does all that background work in terms of processing and registering leases, or they have a history of just doing the Buckshee option and they don't go through Canada and it's totally off the books, right? And so land code is all about bringing things into a formal legal format. So developing that process could be very important. Another really common question in terms of granting interest is how do we recognize the interest that members have in First Nation land? So under the Indian Act, those were certificates of possession. Under a land code, you can develop a new type of interest, an allotment of some kind. You can call it a certificate of possession if you want, but nowadays, especially, there's a lot of interest in members who want to build and own their own homes. Well, if a member owns their home, what kind of interest do they have in the land that the home sits on, right? That's a really common question and decision that First Nations have to make. And finally, just with respect to land development activities, again, this is such a broad area of decision making, but some common examples, there's a given development that wants to proceed. They're likely going to need some form of authorization from the First Nation, whether it's a land development permit, a soil permit, a geotechnical investigation. There's so much to land development, right? So a lot of decisions are going to be triggered by land developments. There's a need to monitor those developments, ensure compliance. Again, there's that process piece. How do we ensure that a development, follows our laws and that other developments are going to follow the same process? And really just understanding your land code authority. Again, it's so critical. All these pieces that are on the left side, leadership, staff, all those roles and authorities, it's so important for the people who sit in those roles to really understand the laws and the land code that they're working within, so that when development opportunities do come forward, those people know the process, they know the requirements, and they follow that consistent process. So we're building trust, right? We're being consistent and building that trust in the community. Over to you, Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so just looking at some examples of community-based decision-making, and this is more from the engagement side of things. So using traditional knowledge, gathering and sharing workshops, those are community-based engagement processes which feed into that decision-making process, right? It's like that baseline information that can be provided. Community visioning sessions, so doing tour of the proposed lands to be developed, the community coming together, being on the land, looking at what that means to them, and really getting a sense. It can be a really powerful thing. Targeted engagement with community members, so whether that's a session just with elders or youth, or even impacted business owners or CP landsholders, all this targeted engagement can really help, I think, build that trust, but also provides opportunities for education. And I think it's a really key piece. And going back to Stephen's slide there's staff, and there's chief and council, and there's community members and people with interests. Education is going to be a really key part of this, is because if people know what the rules are and know how they impact them, then they're more apt to follow them. If they're not involved in that process, if it's just a, let's say, consultant-driven process or just a land staff-driven process, there's a large chance that that those rules may not be understood, and then as a result of that won't be followed. Another community-based decision-making process would be ratification of a land use plan, as identified in the land code. So coming together and voting on the land use plan, and then just communicating outcomes. So it's saying, okay, we heard your input, we received all the information that you provided to us, and this is how it was used. Here are the outcomes from those decisions, and really bringing the community members into that. It's like that accountability piece there, right? It's saying, okay, we have to be accountable for the decisions that we made together. So what was the result of those decisions, and then how can we move forward from here? And then just looking at the just some different other aspects of land use planning and building trust. So it's informing, involving, and empowering community voices. It's working together to establish that community vision, and then just transparent decision making that really does incorporate community voices. Sorry, and then just bottom row here is mutually developing goals and targets, collectively identifying issues and preferences. So this middle one here, I actually kind of want to focus on. So collectively identifying issues, it can be a challenge, right? Because different people in the community and different people who are impacted differently by those decisions are going to have different issues. And so that's really when you have to kind of put on your planning superhero outfit and really work hard to make sure that you can balance those interests. And I think clearly communicating that, right? So there's nothing worse than if you go to a community meeting, someone expresses that they're concerned about this, someone else expresses that they're not concerned about that, and then a choice is made, and whether for better or worse, you're going to align more with one person than the other. So I think it's really important to communicate to that person who maybe didn't feel like they would have been heard, to say, okay, this is how that decision was made, and this is why it was made. And just to walk through how that decision-making process was made, and that will help build trust. And ultimately, hopefully, will not push that person away from the process, but bring them further in to say, okay, I get that, that makes sense. And then to be more involved in going forward. So if we could go on the next slide there, please. Yeah, thanks. So just looking at community engagement requirements that could be triggered by a land code. So these are certain activities that may trigger community engagement. So it could be a lands advisory committee or lands authority, any of those decisions that are being made, land use, environmental, and community planning processes, law development, membership meetings, and then ratification votes. And then just understanding that other community approvals may be required for heritage designations, land exchanges, amendments to your land code, or even amendments to your land use plan and environmental management plans. So there's a really big role for a community to play in decision making when it comes to planning. Next slide. So just part 4 here, just some tools and techniques to help build trust in the planning process. We really just want to provide some more on the ground techniques to help build trust as you go through that planning process.
Thanks, Adam. I see that there are a couple comments in the chat, but if folks are okay, maybe we'll just finish off our last few slides and then we'll jump into the discussion piece. Again, this slide is really just a reminder that planning and community-based decision-making, it's all about building trust and trying to build consensus, cooperation, consent, all those good things. You know, you can try and do that through community-based decision-making.
Yeah, and so just community engagement really is a builder of trust. And I know these are very simple things, but if you're able to provide transportation for community events, childcare, food, those like simple things, I think that really shows to your community members that you care about them and that you care about them being involved, and you're providing opportunities for them to be engaged in that process meaningfully. You know, I have 2 children, and I've brought them to a community meeting in the past, and sometimes it's good, and sometimes they're not paying attention and they distract you and they're running around, you know, tearing stuff off the walls. So it's nice to have that opportunity just to fully engage as a parent. But then also just understanding whose voice maybe isn't being heard. So scanning around the room, making sure that people are being engaged in the way that works for them, right? You can't force people to contribute, but understanding the community and how people like to be engaged. Having protocols that are rooted in your community's culture and your traditional ways. I think that's a big thing of building trust and showing that this is all about our community and how we move forward. And then the establishing meeting and ground rules. I think that's an important one. If you are going through some more contentious issues or items where there may be some potential for disputes, just to establish those ground rules of trust, mutual respect, not talking over people, really simple things, but that can really help so everyone's operating from the same set of rules. And then just the last point there, listening and caring. I think that's the biggest thing there is if people felt heard and they know that you care about their opinions, then that's really going to go a long way in building trust. And so just looking at different ways that you can build trust, again, is community-led facilitation. So maybe it's bringing in certain youth or elders to help lead the facilitation, right? So I know for me, whenever I was in class and the teacher would bring me up, if I was chatting away in the back and they'd bring me up to then lead, I definitely paid more attention and was more involved. And so I think sometimes it's a way, if you can bring community members in to lead the process, then they understand the gravity and they understand some of the challenges and probably more likely to buy in and to be more engaged in the process. The role of listening, I had touched upon that in my previous slide, but really critical in planning, really listening and hearing what folks are saying, creating atmosphere for respect, and then again, communicating results to community members. So just when people invest time, they appreciate seeing the fruits of their labor, right? So it helps to build trust, knowing that their input is being acted upon or at least considered.
All right, I think it's worth just a brief description about or discussion about online engagement tools. Obviously, this virtual Links to Learning event is an example of that in this pandemic world that we live in. But I think really the main thing I wanted to convey is that online engagement, if you have the time and budget for it, it can go well beyond just a Zoom meeting. And if we have time, actually in this presentation, Adam might take us through a really cool online tool. But again, there's really great online planning platforms that if you, again, these are likely require some kind of subscription or payment to use, but you can do really cool things online. Participatory budgeting, just collecting ideas from people. You can do online mapping, online voting, project management. There's just so many cool ways that you can do online engagement, in addition to the typical things that we go to: virtual meetings, social media, websites, and emails. There's a lot more to it. So if anybody's ever interested in that, just shoot Adam and I an email, and we can throw some resources your way.
Yeah, and so just building on that a little bit more, obviously because of COVID, community members have had to pivot how they engage. There's lots of platforms and engagement tools available. And so this is more like my words of caution, is that engagement platforms online, they must really be accessible to all community members, unless you're targeting a specific section of your community. But you really have to think about that accessibility piece. Online engagement can be costly, and sometimes there's not much to show from it. So it's really understanding, okay, hey, is my community, are they like a Facebook community? And if so, let's just use Facebook. Let's not try to point them towards a website for this project if they're not going to go there anyways. And so it's really thinking about what's the most effective / efficient way to use online engagement. And then really, yeah, that effective, meaningful community engagement. So I think just based on the time, I probably won't be able to go through that example because I would like us to have some discussion, but Denise just posted in the chat that we will have a session on community engagement following this, so we can dig in a little bit further there. And then just a final point here is that online engagement is only one aspect of a larger approach. So, there's on-the-line engagement, and obviously all these are with COVID protocols in place and whatever your community feels comfortable doing. But on the land engagement, so it's doing walking tours, community events. I know that there is a community that actually was handing out like boxed meals sort of thing. So even though you couldn't have like a community feast or supper together, you at least have like some food that's nice to have and something that's at least warm in the belly. Targeted engagement we talked about. And then also going old school and using either telephone, then you can have like I'm not sure if people remember, but there used to be like chat lines on telephones that you could have, or you could have like a whole bunch of people on the same line and you could just talk about it, right? It's almost like a telephone open house. Or you can use the radio, and if your community has, I know some communities have like their own little radio stations and transmitters, and you can even use that and just say, hey, here's old time planning hour with, you can do that and mix it up, right? It doesn't have to be the same approach. Yeah, so maybe, I'm not sure, Stephen, if you had anything else to add.
For this one, yeah, I think the only thing I would add in terms of, the larger engagement piece is really engaging with your leadership and your advisory committees in a self-governing context. That's so key. And I'm not sure who's all participating in this session, but for the lands managers out there, it's just so important to have that support and understanding from your leadership and your advisory committees. So just want to really emphasize that as well. That's it for me, though.
Awesome. So I know that there's a couple questions in the chat box. If you want to, like, is there one? I'm not sure if you can see them, Stephen. I'm happy to answer either, or you want to, like, you can take one, I'll take the other.
Sure. I see one from Stephanie. Do you have any examples of a community that incorporated traditional knowledge into community-based decision-making and land use planning? So that's a really a great question, Stephanie. Thanks for that. It's a tough one to answer, but I will say that a land use plan really functions to guide decision making. So when leadership and with staff, when they're faced with a decision that's really tough, it's useful to refer to your land use plan, because oftentimes land use plans set out a vision and they set out guiding principles. And in my experience working with nations across the country, it's those guiding principles where the traditional knowledge piece really comes forth. And talking about traditional stewardship and caretaking roles, the need to respect one another, those traditional laws that they're often not impossible, but it's hard to translate them into written laws, like land code laws. But in my opinion, they're just as important and just as valid. And so I think it's in those guiding principles in a land use plan where those traditional laws and traditional knowledge can guide decisions. And there's also really practical things like, if your community does a traditional use study or some kind of project or study where you're talking to your elders, you can identify areas based on traditional knowledge that need to be protected. And then you can use your land code authorities to protect those areas, and you can, set up processes to, regarding decision making about, heritage sites and that sort of thing. So I think there are great concrete examples of incorporating traditional knowledge into land code governance. And if you like, Stephanie, please send us an email. And we can talk kind of more about your community situation and identify some options for you.
Yeah, and just adding to that, I think it can also be something that's very simple too, right? It's like, how, as a community member, how are you impacted by this certain event, right? So it's like using traditional knowledge as almost like community knowledge, right? Like sometimes it can be just community's knowledge and how they're impacted by certain development or proposed development. So it can be something that's just more simple as well on the ground. So I'm going to go to the next question here from Katie Bob Sampson. There are areas we'd like to protect, but they're, if you know, culturally significant areas. Have other nations named those types of areas on the LUP? Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think obviously this is going to be whatever your community is comfortable with, but I think those areas you do want to protect, and I would be inclined to probably not, let's say, advertise those through my land use plan. So there's ways that you can hide those in mapping. You can just call them culturally significant areas and have it cross-hatched off and not really pinpointing specific areas. So just generally, we're protecting this area because of cultural significance. But it is a little bit tough sometimes if I'm reading this right, like some people just won't know about those. It's like, and you don't want to spread that. You don't want to, like, you kind of want to keep it your hidden gem, or you want to like hide it so it's protected. And I get that. And so it's really what your community is comfortable with is like, how do we protect this the best, or how do we honor this land the best, or whatever path forward your community wants to take with those lands. But yeah, I have seen them just kind of hide them through like a big polygon and cross hatch it and call it culturally sensitive.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think this is, depending on your community's context, I think it's really important to have those areas protected and like Adam said, you don't have to name them, but just, you know, as long as they're protected in your land use plan, and you've got your land code authorities behind you, because there's a lot of external interests that are attracted to First Nation lands, you know, in terms of you know, ECDEV corporations and external proponents that want to develop on your lands, and they don't have that kind of if you know, you know, knowledge behind them. They're from outside the community, right? And so you need those legal protections. And even for staff, like a lands manager, you might hire someone from outside the community as your lands manager, and they're not going to have that kind of knowledge, right? So having it in your plan, and again, there's ways to keep it confidential, and you can have those kind of internal maps and internal databases that aren't shared publicly, but really key for the people who are going to be approving land developments and other activities on the land to know. So really good to formally collect that knowledge, do a traditional use and occupancy study, and have processes in place that when land development is triggered, you know, that filter is placed on that development, so it doesn't go ahead and destroy a really significant site or something like that. Not seeing any other comments, Adam, but maybe we can just kind of put up some of these discussion points. So I'll put it to the group, you know, in terms of our message about building trust in planning and in land code governance. You know, just curious to hear from our participants, what does building trust look like in your community? What kind of trust related issues have you run into, and what sort of strategies have you used to get around that and to build trust? Adam and I are pretty open to any kind of conversation, so anything you guys want to talk about, but yeah, maybe we'll open up the floor, and if anybody wants to share, feel free to jump on the mic or raise your hand, and we can facilitate it that way as well. I'm not sure how much time we have left. It's 10:10.
And maybe one point, just that third bullet there, I'd be curious, and you can just answer in the chat, it'd be great, but I am more curious, like, so decolonization of planning and looking at the role that music and dance and food play in community-based decision-making. I think, like, yeah, would your community consider using a planning process that doesn't produce a written report? Like, could it be could a video be, could it be a song? Could it be, you know, like, can you be a community feast, and that's how you inform and educate and move forward? I'm just curious to get folks' thoughts on that.
I've actually been, and that was part of my question, I've been trying to wrap my mind around, there's some grants available that would allow for that, but I'm having a really hard time tying it to the land use plan and like making a case for why we need this to make this document come to life, I guess, and be relevant for our community. But yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion around food sovereignty and the fact that, you know, our forests are really not doing so great in the province, and the stewardship that we a lot of folks have maybe strayed away from. Like, so there's certain plants that aren't as abundant as they used to be, that we used to eat all the time, and so I'm trying to like figure out how to put those two pieces together in terms of engaging community around, because there's the desire for it for sure. It has been identified as something that folks in the community want and are interested in, are concerned about, and identified as a top priority. We've got like 3 top priorities that they've identified. So I'm just trying to figure out how to do that, but then like get the funding for it too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that's a good question, Stephanie. It's something that, like, and we're happy to have conversations offline too, but it could be just like, maybe it would be that there is a written piece to it, but it's very like basic, and it's serving the needs of the fund, right? So you're using that to communicate to the funders, because that's a medium that is familiar with them and that they consider legitimate. right? But then it's like the other side of it is like creating a system that is legitimate within the community, right? And something that speaks to them. And I'm sure that you could get some elders to speak on the importance of food and culture and that, right? And that would, in my mind, would be quite enough to provide legitimacy to it if that's what's needed, right?
If I could add to that too, the work isn't done when you've got a land use plan. Oftentimes land use plans provide direction for further, more focused plans. So that could be something you can consider in your planning process is, we know these are issues and we're going to, dedicate resources in the future to figuring that out, but at least it gets captured in your plan. And with respect to funding, there's such a huge need to decolonize how funding programs work. And as you know, the Resource Center does provide a lot of funding for planning and other things. So we're eager for your feedback. Let us know what is working and what is not working. And we can take that, to our higher ups at the Resource Center and to Canada and to try and, get more flexible approaches to planning funding. So I think we're pretty much done. Hey, Adam, I think we wrap up at 10:15 according to the agenda, or 10:15 Pacific time, I should say. Really, thanks everybody for participating in the session. We hope you learned a lot. And again, Adam and I are really happy to connect with you guys offline and continue this conversation. So thanks so much. And like Denise said, we've got another session, I think at 10:45 on more about community engagement. So hope to see you there.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Have a great day.